Hi, class. This week we'll be diving into our first novella, The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Laval. As we'll discuss, this short novel is a reconceptualization or an attempt by Laval to write back against Lovecraft's short story, The Horror at Red Hook. Once you begin reading The Ballad of Black Tom, you'll definitely notice parallels and similarities. In fact, Laval basically rewrites The Horror at Red Hook through the eyes of a black man. And he does this by taking many of Lovecraft's literary motifs and symbols and transforming them into an examination of race, white privilege, power, and aspects of social consciousness that many of us are becoming increasingly familiar with today. We'll see how Laval transforms a fairly racist, misogynistic story into one that sheds light on some very real horrors that still exist for Black Americans and other minorities in the 21st century. So this week we'll focus on elements of horror within Black Tom, and next week we'll dive into the Gothic elements of the novella. And just to remind ourselves, whereas magical realism transforms the everyday into the awesome and the unreal, horror involves threats against what culture or society deems to be, quote, normal, or a breach in the purity of the nature of being. Both forms are inherently transgressive, which means that both horror and magical realism attempt to subvert the authority or the management of a powerful system that's been put in place, and that's probably been in place for a while. Horror shares with Gothic the intent to provoke an emotional, even visceral or physical response. This means that horror is very often related to feelings and emotions, as opposed to intellectual responses to fear. In this PowerPoint, I introduce us to some of the elements of landscape and setting that are integral to an understanding of eco-criticism, a theory or lens within literary studies that's an umbrella term for the study of the relationships between literature and the physical environment. Eco-critics are as likely to examine human perceptions of wilderness and wild spaces as they are to examine the effects of the buildings around us, the built environment or cityscapes of human cultures. Ecology, sustainable designs, biopolitics, environmentalism, and the human place in the world are only a few of the broad categories of thought that make up eco-critical studies. So to sum up, this PowerPoint moves through ideas we've discussed during our reading of Devil Deer, and then through ideas related to eco-criticism. As always, the final slide has a list of vocabulary terms associated with this week's reading, so please be sure to take a close look at that last slide. As we dive into our first long work, let's remind ourselves of one of the most important elements of literature. Literature is a vehicle of ideology as well as an instrument for its undoing. This is a key element of the Ballad of Black Tom, which is essentially a revisioning of Lovecraft's story, The Horror at Red Hook. In other words, the Ballad of Black Tom is a rewriting of the horror at Red Hook from the point of view of a black man. Now, we looked briefly at Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff, which is similar in the sense that Ruff doesn't just reshape or rewrite one Lovecraft story. Instead, he takes the New England setting used by H.P. Lovecraft in many of his weird fiction tales and elaborates and revises a whole host of elements Lovecraft wrote about throughout his career. Much of this has to do with Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, a topic we'll discuss a little later. As regards literary theory, let's recall that theories are like lenses that allow us to analyze and speculate about meaning in a text by critiquing ideas that on the surface seem natural, but upon decoding and closer inspection, open up broader avenues of thought. So throughout these past couple of weeks, we've been engaged in a critical reading of the stories we've encountered, focusing on how stories are constructed and how readers, we, have a lot to do with the ultimate and various meanings of texts. This slide introduces us to a couple of terms integral to another theory or lens, eco-criticism. At the broadest level, eco-criticism is an umbrella term that engages the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. I've asked you to define these terms, so feel free to cut and paste from this slide. There's some really good examples here of the stories that we've already read, so please take a close look at the examples I've provided here. So let's imagine we're taking an eco-critical view of Devil Deer, a story that we've already discussed to some length. An eco-critical reading might position the deer as a symbol of an unnaturally mutated environment. And if we take this position, then we can say that the deer has become a living embodiment of a ruined landscape, a landscape ruined by man's own scientific overreaching, a trope that goes all the way back to 1818 and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, I've got a couple of questions here, a couple of points. The first point is about agency. And we'll talk a little bit about agency as we move through Black Tom. But one of the questions that I've got here is the devil deer more than a symbol of a natural landscape that has been, quote, corrupted by man? Is the deer more like a walking diseased wound that acts as a guide towards some new knowledge for Cruz's community? And the second point asks us to think about the human experience. Now, we know that humans and the human experience is bound within a world that's shaped by both nature and culture. So if we think along these terms, the deer is not just an antagonist or even an antagonist, but a living agent that compels Cruz and his community to think differently about their community's place in the world. Now, this slide introduces us to the idea of place. And place is not simply location, but an extension of culture, language, values, morals, beliefs, customs, traditions, ways of life, and even historical periods. Additionally, the term conceit, which is a little like metaphor, but actually a lot more nuanced, helps us see how actions and plot points, such as the transformation of a man into an axolotl, or even the interruption of a task or action by a character, can actually shape a much broader parallel to a really complex idea. We'll discuss the idea of conceit and place more as we get into Black Tom, but I'd like you to pay particular attention to this slide. Think about what you're being asked to envision in terms of conceit and place as having more of the attitude and value system than an actual location. So the horror at Red Hook is what we'll be discussing this week, and we're discussing it to pretty much prepare ourselves to discuss the Ballad of Black Tom. This is a short story that was first published in Weird Tales in 1927. And we see the cover of Weird Tales here. And pretty much everything that you need to know about this story can be found at this really cool website called Cthulhu Coffee. So please take a look as you're reading The Horror at Red Hook. H.P. Lovecraft is known for his archaic and sometimes arcane language, so it's a little tough to get into this story. And I've got a lot of questions here to ask as you're reading the story. So ask yourself questions about the built environment. Is the built environment, the cityscape, a catalyst for the action that comes, or maybe even character development? Think about the idea of fear as Lovecraft describes it in supernatural horror? How about the idea of the other? How is this emotion of fear related to the other? Finally, I'd ask you to look up the term Faustian bargain and ask yourself, has someone made a Faustian bargain in this story? What about Stephen King's ideas regarding horror and terror and revulsion? Our reading of the horror at Red Hook is going to be really helpful for a better understanding of Black Tom. Finally, here are some terms to add to your ongoing vocabulary list. So please define these terms using Bedford and any PowerPoints that we've got.